This June, I'll be gathering a small circle of 5 or 6 folks who feel drawn to walk the next solar cycle in conscious relationship with their own mortality. Rooted in the question of what truly becomes essential when we befriend death as an ally, this journey offers a slow and soulful space for a wholehearted reckoning, a deepening and sweetening into intimacy, a fierce embrace of grief, fear, and praise, all centered in a steady devotion to what is most vibrantly alive. More than a program, it's an invitation to be gathered up in the life-giving heart of impermanence, held within the tender companionship of a small committed group. This is a virtual group initiation, a year-long passage into the vital mysteries of impermanence. Together we will tend to unfinished business, cultivate enriched intimacy with life, and close the cycle with a ritual death and rebirth. Each month includes 2 group sessions and at least 1 one-on-one session with me, offering space for both collective exploration and personal integration. I trust that this container will serve as a potent threshold, clarifying, humbling, and transformational. And I'm so honored and stoked to step into it with those who feel the call. I'll be sharing more details as the weeks unfold, but if something in you stirs already, you're welcome to reach out for an insight call to explore whether this journey is meant for you. In other news, I'm hosting a virtual gathering on May 31st called Rise and Revitalize, an online gathering to enliven and embrace the wild bloom of becoming. One of our guest speakers is Azra Bertrand, who joined me in the last episode of this project, and another upcoming guest will also be part of the gathering. 2 additional speakers will be announced soon, and I've created an early event page where you can learn more. The link to that, along with everything else that I've mentioned, can be found in the show notes. And lastly, I've just launched a new Substack publication called Hearthwoven. I shared the introductory essay this week, reflecting on the meaning behind the name and why it feels significant to me. Hearthwoven is going to be a home for essays, poetry, podcast episodes, and bonus content, including expanded conversations from this project, eventually. I would love to have you there as an early subscriber. For now, all offerings are freely available, with the likelihood of a modest paywall in the future to help sustain the creative energy behind all that I make. And now, let's turn to today's conversation. Welcome to Wild Heart Revival, a gathering place for heartfelt conversations and stories as pathways of renewal and revival. I'm your host, Tay Tayari, and today's guest is Aaron Johnson. In this conversation, Aaron shares powerful insights on embracing tenderness and closeness as transformative pathways toward healing and holistic activism. He reflects on how the grief of his father's death opened his emotional capacity, reconnecting him with deeper, more sensitive parts of himself. We explore how slowing down to truly see and be with one another becomes a radical healing act, and how intimacy is essential for dismantling oppression and building rooted connection. Aaron also speaks to reclaiming tenderness, especially within Black masculinity. He also speaks to the power of touch and somatic connection, and how rewilding our lives creates space for ancestral healing and co-liberation. Aaron Johnson is a public speaker, facilitator, and touch activist, fostering environments where Black-bodied individuals can express their fullest selves. As a founder of Holistic Resistance, Grief to Action, and the Chronically Undertouched Project, Aaron takes the time to hold the stories of Black people around homophobia, transphobia, and internalized racism. Aaron's journey began, as it does for many Black men, with lack of loving and platonic touch. Now he assists other Black men in developing holistic touch practices to move from a chronically undertouched state into touch balance. Aaron aims to create spaces for Black people and people of the global majority to connect with each other and the earth. He and his team are establishing retreats and workshops on Black-owned land in the Mojave Desert and beyond to promote emotional and physical tenderness, platonic connection, and singing, which enhances the healing process for those overlooked by mainstream society. If you are new to the show, welcome. You may like to know that I'm a threshold counselor with an online practice devoted to supporting wanderers, wanderers, and edgewalkers. I offer individual, couples, and group counsel, as well as guidance around death and dying. If you'd like to learn more, you'll find a link to my website in the show notes. I also offer free insight calls, risk-free spaces where we can connect, explore our alignment, and see if we're a good fit to walk alongside each other through a pivotal chapter of your life. I'm always open to meaningful connections, whether for guidance, curiosity, collaboration, or simply to share in a heartfelt conversation. If you feel called, feel free to reach out anytime. And if you haven't yet, I invite you to subscribe to Wild Heart Revival on your favorite podcast platforms. And consider joining us on YouTube as well to tune into the video component of these wonderful conversations. Your likes, comments, ratings, and shares are deeply appreciated, and they play an essential role in supporting the organic growth of this project. Now, let's orient our tender hearts together toward our wise and wonderful guest for today, Aaron Johnson. So I'm wondering if at the beginning here you would care to share a moment or perhaps a series of moments that catalyzed what seems to be your lifelong commitment to tending to and hopefully eventually ending racism through intimacy and embodiment and closeness, as you call it.
Yeah. One of the things that started this, but I didn't realize it was starting, was the death of my father. I think my father's death highlighted my inability to grieve, to be tender, to allow grief to move through my body. I didn't have that language, but there was a locked up. I wasn't able to cry for him and his death until 3 years later. And it was I think a practical conversation I was having with my partner at the time and eventually my wife, just telling her the story of his death, and she began to weep. And I realized that she never met him. She didn't have the devastation, but just hearing the story, she was having an appropriate response. And in her observation of me not having much emotion around it, she said, we should really look at what it means for you to feel safe enough to feel. And that was the beginning of me being able to realize how much the story of masculinity in America and the story of particularly African heritage masculinity in America, that those forces have quietly been just smothering my ability to be tender. And that awareness just chipped away. It was going to be another 3 years before we started to really form a personal cuddle and touch practice for myself, really examining the Black root history, really examining what it might look like to start to repair that internally. But it was a journey from that spark. First, my father's passing, 2 years later, this conversation I had with Camellia, and then eventually me turning it into practice, like personally, and then all of a sudden it kind of seeped into me working with others after 2 years of me finding myself into a much more touch balance. And I find myself, arriving there, and that really, even though it wasn't gonna show up for the 8 years, that really was the seeds planted for the Chronic and Touch project, which is the active component of bringing people close and really dismantling that barrier of separation that's so prevalent in America.
Yeah, and it's beautiful because the closeness with your partner at that time was this catalyst in allowing you to see more clearly, and so it makes sense that to turn toward the closeness as some kind of an antidote or medicine in this way is Yeah, that's really beautiful, and it makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that background. And I wonder, you describe yourself as a teacher of closeness. I'm just
Mm.
wondering what closeness means to you now, maybe how that's changed over time, and how it becomes a form of healing and activism.
Yeah, my sister has this song, and I sing it in meditation, and it says, lay your heart on my soul, lay your head on my pillow, lay your heart on my soul. And I remember going to her, going, Lilia, what are you referring to when you say lay your heart on my soul? Like that's like the soul is this very powerful, intimate being, and the heart is a very powerful, intimate energy field. What do you mean to lay them next to each other or to on each other? And she just said this amazing share in our conversation. She said, I want to encourage people to be close enough to each other that oppression can't fit in between us. And there
Mm,
was something about how she articulated that in that song that fits as a low key North Star for how unconfused children often are about loving each other, but yet how confused adults are about
mm,
it. And there's something that we all were those unconfused loving beings and how we're shaped. And so really closeness is about remembering and using all the simple tools around us to help us remember. So in essence, earth, music, and I say earth, like literally holding clay and being with earth, is little medicine practice we bring to say, what does it mean to reclaim? And as we get terrified of being close or tender, how to slow ourselves down enough that we don't cause further damage in our nervous systems to be close. And so for me, teaching closeness is really remembering. I always remind us that I'm not bringing something new that your body doesn't already know how to do. I'm just remembering where we were less confused and how do we recognize propaganda and sometimes skillful communication that's misguided us about each other's goodness. And I think for me, that's something that holistic resistance has been able to do from jump, and the Chronic Untouched project has been able to do, and our grief work has been able to really remind ourselves to do that. And so all these arrive in that same simple practice is how do we track where we got confused about each other?
hmm hmm Oh, there's so many important, beautiful threads in that share. I'm reminded when I did my undergrad in university years ago, I did because I focused on psychology, and I did a class that was about like intimate relationships. And there, it seems obvious what I'm about to share, but for some reason it clicked for me. And it was that, of course, for people to enter into like romantic relationships and partnerships, um, one of the most important um, aspects of that even being able to happen is proximity. Of
Mm,
course, that makes a lot of sense, right? If you're not anywhere near each other, you're not going to see each other, meet each other, maybe talk. And so it's proximity that that is like the first doorway into even creating the potential of meeting and coming close and eventually becoming intimate. And again, that seems very obvious, but it's something that maybe folks don't pay attention to enough in terms of healing the wound of separation and exiting the trance of othering, you know. And I'm reminded too, I'm sure you've seen it at some point, where they've done these experiments where they'll bring two people from very different cultures, maybe even cultures that have been in conflict or at war. I remember seeing a Jewish person and a Gazan person. This was some years ago, where they would sit in a room, and the exercise is just to eye gaze and not to speak. And like without a doubt, tears would well up just after some minutes of these total strangers that might have othered each other at some point, that they then feel this closeness just by slowing down, like you're saying, taking the time to really see and gaze upon the other and realize how much they share, how much they share. And that's so beautiful. And I love that talked about touching the clay. I know you do natural earth building, and I'm very curious just to hear whatever comes up for you from what I just shared, but also maybe talking about at some point like this using earth and sensuality with earthen flows and forces as a bridge between each other. I don't know if I have like a question in that, but just to
Mhm.
stimulate it.
Totally. I appreciate the proximity piece. It's not light at all or even simple, because proximity is such a, we're so shaped, we're curated, we're in a curated culture, and especially if you're in the United States. When you leave the United States, maybe you could feel like the different curation, but there's a way that when you talk about the eye gaze, it's so intimate to gaze on or be seen, and to be slowed down and to be seen. I think most of us spend a lot of time walking down, say, a busy city sidewalk. We're just trying to see each other enough to avoid each other, so I don't run into you. Outside of that, I'm passing through, and how little
Mm-hmm.
time we actually take in our adult lives to say, I'm going to look into your face
Mm-hmm.
as adults and adults for more than 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and to give you attention. Like, and I might even add a little bit of intention around, like, what if I actually start bringing positive, loving thoughts towards you, even if it's not like intimately detailed, but just like there is love in this human being, admiring your life force, admiring just that level of opening up
Mm-hmm.
is such a rarity. And I think not to drift too far, but it's going to circle back to the natural building, clay, sensuality, humanality of the earth. But there's a way that um, childhood intimacy and closeness is quietly, and mostly, I think my experience, what I witnessed and experienced myself through education, your elementary school, junior high, high school, how we just kind of start shredding away our singing voice, our relationship with the earth, our ability to start kind of getting in clicks and the popularity and trying to get the scraps and preparation for the limited amount of contact that we will when we get into the adult world.
Yeah.
And it's quick and it's quiet and it's almost in the background. We might not even look up until I was 29 years old. My father passed away before I even looked around and said, something here needs to shift.
Mm.
Right. So it's 29 years of not crying. I would say 29. It was probably 25. I cried up to about 6 years old. So it's 20 years of already locking in my tears. And so what I
Mm-hmm.
say is that when I think of the profound power of breaking the pattern of the routine of typical mainstream culture and say, I'm going to sit and gaze at someone. I'm going to sit and quiet my mind enough to be seen and to see. It's a real interruptive action as adults because we just don't do that behavior often. Workshops help sometimes. Sometimes you might go to a festival and they might encourage some kind of workshop, but
Mm-hmm.
in a daily practice, it's not there. And I think also what I really appreciate Cal Earth, and I want to really honor them as an organization because living in a high desert, I was in a typical house, and I was in an art class. And my art teacher said there's an amazing organization near you called Cal Earth, and they do architecture with earth buildings or with
Mm-hmm.
earth. And I was like, what? My brain didn't even know what that was. I couldn't even comprehend it, but I eventually drove over there, only 15 minutes from my house. I've been there for 30 years, or at that time, 20 years. And I went in there and I was like, oh, this is making my mind really reevaluate earth, reevaluate shelter, start to ask bigger and more important questions about how we build houses in America. And what they also spoke about is, what does it mean to be close? What does it mean to put your hands in the earth and to let the earth be on you and to recognize how much we are the earth? And that seems simple for folks that maybe live in like parts of Seattle, Washington, and parts of really lush places. But in the
Mm-hmm.
Mojave Desert and with a place that was kind of somewhat being more urbanized, cement has been put over all that. And so there's this beautiful gray space of building that relationship back with the earth was a big part of my platonic and sensual touch plan. Now I have a practice of touch, and the earth is a part of that. But prior to that point, it never been seated. I touched plastic and wood and kind of fabricated things, even in a country environment in my typical house. And so to live, eventually living in a dome that I could put my hands on the walls, not only feel clay, but I could also feel the indentions that my community plastered that wall. I could see handprints in the wall. I could see markings in the wall where it wasn't just myself. It was a connection with all the folks that said, I love you. I'm going to help you build your house. I
Mm,
love you. I'm going to be here and help you build your simple shelter that you're going to live in for a period of time. So I think that becomes where earth meets shelter, meets intimacy, and has huge implications on our sensual being, on our tender being, which are very much first cousins. That's the place I didn't know I entered into when I thought I was going to go visit this kind of unique place of shelter. It just was a shelter, such a shaping force of all of us, and shapes how we interact with each other. And so I think for me, um, I realized that I connect differently in and around natural buildings than I do around plastic buildings or around wood buildings that are covered with like cement or whatnot.
hmm That's so sensible to me, and I 100% agree. There's something you said there that I'd love to hear you speak to more. You said that my sensual being is first cousins with my tenderness, something like
Right,
that.
right.
Could you speak more to that? That's profound and beautiful and important.
Yeah. So I think for me, I grew up in a very sex negative home,
Mm,
Christian conservative. So it's hard for us to talk about just simple um, human anatomy.
yeah.
Modesty was weaponized. So clothes, long sleeves was like the way you keep yourself clean and clear. And so there's a way that as I started to really examine the access to my sensuality, I realized that it was tender. I had to like grieve some of the guilt and shame. It was such a tender experience as I began to really redefine my own body, not how mainstream Hollywood or the mainstream pornography industry define it, but how I intimately
hmm
hold it. It's a tender experience. It was vulnerable on a level that I did not realize I would have needed and need still.
hmm
And then I think there's a place where tenderness is, I think, an unsung hero in the erotic space. There's a way that there's oftentimes for, say, a black male, that a lot of the propaganda postures are us like dominant and intense and aggressive, and we really are fueled by the black root trauma story of America. And so it feels almost interruptive and sometimes shocking when tenderness arrives with that typical story being told in this particular body. And so as I developed my own sensual space, as I started to track how tenderness for me was so arousing, how tenderness for me allowed me to taste more of the flavors of my erotic self. That when I leaned exclusively into the brute narrative, into the propaganda narrative, that I felt incomplete. I
Mm,
felt like it was 10% of my identity. But when I opened up the tenderness space, all of a sudden queerness didn't feel so far away. All of a sudden, homophobia got to be grieved. All of a sudden, I got to see more parts of my body more than like my penis and booty as like the only sexual space. All of a sudden, my entire skin palette became available because it wasn't a far separation of tenderness. Now, what's next to tenderness is tears. I
mm,
never saw tears should arrive in erotic space prior to my own tenderness being available because I didn't see that in Hollywood. I didn't see that in mainstream pornography. I'm not here to even critique pornography, but I just know there's a level of unchecked oppressive material in there that's fed to folks without any sense of awareness of where the racism and oppression is there. Erotic images are amazing. I'm all positive on those, but when there's the way it's wielded mainstream wise is a problem, and I was a victim of that narrative. And so I didn't see tears, I didn't see grief, I didn't see tenderness next to and woven into orgasmic spaces. That was not ever allowed. And so in that space, I started to see quite clearly that there was an agenda, an unchecked agenda of oppression
mm,
attached to my prescribed sexual space, tender space. And so the tender place was like a little key that no one really spoke to in all the sex positives I was in, and especially not in black male bodies in America. It was like That was, we might saw it in certain other identities, but not in Black male bodies in America. And so that was like, oh, what is this? And also, I'll name and land here is that tenderness across all aspects of human experience, from sensual to communication to grief, tenderness is so hard to dehumanize any population if we
Hmm.
acknowledge their tenderness, because tenderness is such a part of humanity that activates our awareness that that's another human being across from me. If I can witness and acknowledge that they can be tender, that they
Hmm.
can feel in that way, it's hard to put them onto slave ships. It's hard to exploit them when you have that awareness. And so there's a piece around tenderness that allows both of all those to be seen. So it's not unique to this sensual space, but it's definitely something that shows up in that sensual space. And so tenderness has been that beautiful unsung hero in my journey of finding myself and finding my work in myself, meaning that my work of the chronic and touch and the dark and tender. You'll see this word tender pop up again and again in my work. It's a low key, but not low key, but piece that shapes a lot of my best thinking.
Hmm.
So that's
Hmm.
kind of a piece that I think sits next to that tender and sensuality piece.
Thank you for sharing that, man. I feel like you said things that I could have even said myself, and because I've experienced that in my own life, how tenderness and the deepening into tenderness has allowed me to be more responsive, more adaptable, more receptive to the reality that's present. And so it's a really important piece for people to wrap up in their heart cloth and take with them. Like, the more tender you are, the less rigid you are, meaning the more you're going to be able to see things clearly, feel things more clearly, more deeply. And so then you'll be able to respond, reciprocate, collaborate in a more real rooted way. Like, it's so important. And I'm sure you know Bayo Komalafe about his work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He talks about how we need a tenderness, or a politics of tenderness today.
Mm.
And so I would like to hear you speak to that. And specifically, I've seen you, or I've heard you speak to intimacy with Blackness as some kind of a core principle in the work that you do. And so I'm wondering about how this politics of tenderness that Bio introduces um, uh, can be maybe entwined or entangled with that sense of intimacy with Blackness.
Yeah. I think it's interesting in the context of, the politics of tenderness versus the intimate with Blackness is that it's funny when I say intimate with Blackness, and most people go straight to like hypersexualization, which is a part of um, the erasure of the complete Black being and history, and of any population that's trying to be controlled. It's really important that they kind of slice us up into pieces that they can control. And so I think the politics of, you know, I, I think for me, what I land on is where liberation grows. And one thing I find with my closest to Blackness journey has been a lot of changing my shelter, changing how much time I take. I might spend 6 hours a day making money. And if I can reduce that down to 3 hours a day, I have the space to actually notice who I am. And so there's a way that
Mm,
the politics is a part of capitalism, in America at least, that there's this tricky, effective manner of speed is valued, slowness is poverty. And but yet if you're wealthy, you have time to slow down. If you have resource, you have time to actually take the time to do that. And so I think there's a way that I have found my investment in being close to my own Blackness and intimacy with Blackness is really about unplugging from capitalism on a regular basis, and also noticing where I've internalized it, where I enjoy. I'm talking to you right now on an iPhone. This is not a
mm,
uncapitalist structure. So knowing where I can participate, but also not attach too much of my soul to it. And it's a constant untangling. And so for me, the untangling, I have to be gentle and tender with myself as I continue to kind of step further back and out of capitalism as a
Mm,
way that it takes my time, it monetizes my body, it monetizes my sex appeal. And so I think a part of it, intimacy, is really peeling those off and really falling in love with my body outside of its cash value, either as a worker, how much it's valued in the sex appeal, my age, my strength, my athleticism, all those things that are typically monetized, and being able to say, what does it mean to arrive as priceless as possible? And then what then can take that place? What then can take, because I have a hard time sometimes replacing my behavior. Like if I'm not doing capitalism, what is my other behavior?
mm,
Right? That can still navigate the IRS and gas prices and housing cost and navigating how do I get from here to Chuck in Oregon? How do I get to here, Chuck in New York in 3 days when someone wants to be there without completely being tangled back into capitalism? And so I think there's a way that um, I have to really be practical and and intimate with my own um, internalized attraction to consumption culture and to capitalism to find my blackness amongst that. And that is to me a dance that I so appreciate, going back to the natural building, going back to living in the desert, going back to living minimalist. That has been really one of the key things. I think it's easy for me to sit and say, oh, it's because of blackness, but I don't have time. I'm trying to launch my film. I'm trying to launch these things, and I'm like, some of those effective launches require me to participate in capitalism on a level, but not let it internalize and stick to me. So it's a dance. It's this dance of like, advocating for minimalism, but needing to actually have a big impact, having big to generate resource, a good resource. You have to then have a payroll and have a payroll to hire a team. So I think for me, I go into that genre of like capitalism versus my intimacy, finding myself is taking Earth with me. It is when I travel now, I'm driving, not flying. So I have a bucket of clay in my back of my truck. And I remember I was like, getting that clay out and working that clay. This is clay I harvested from my land there in the Mojave Desert. This is close to blackness, right? For me, right? For someone else, it's whatever their cultural background is. But for me, touching that clay is me reclaiming my blackness, me reminding myself this clay is not less valuable than this iPhone that I use. They all have their purpose, but just untangling myself. And I would also say that words like intimacy and politics are being redefined right now. I think there's a way they're being redefined in a way that I'm learning how to not let them be so polarizing for myself, and realize that there's a simple solution in words and actions to intimacy. And so for me, I land the politics of intimacy that is untangling myself daily from capitalism, that invites me the ability to slow down and be with the earth and be with myself. And if the stars align right, to be with a handful of other human beings, they're able to escape as well, and to find that path out for other folks to step out of, um, and with each other. Because I'm not trying to escape by myself. I really want to take folks with me. At the
mhm,
same time, it's a dance. And so for me, it's that journey. And I'm not convinced that I've figured it all out yet, but I feel like I feel closer daily. I
mm,
feel closer daily. Um, and looking forward to kind of arriving to a place of like a quick exit if
mm,
needed.
mm, mhm. I hope that comes soon, brother, for sure. Um, I interviewed this woman, Jan Blake. She's this beautiful black woman from the UK, and she's a professional storyteller. And
Mm,
so we were talking about stories, and I brought up a question, something wanting to speak to like, what does she think of the notion of like rewilding our
mm,
stories? And she said she said something like, I don't get what you mean by that. She's like, I don't get what people are meaning by that. um and she said she takes something on the end saying like, when I was growing up, wildness was a bad thing, right? To be black and wild was a bad thing. So so even now, many years later, she still has this sense of like, I don't understand what you're all meaning by that. And I felt like I touched on something sensitive, and so I felt kind of bad about that, and been thinking about it over time. And yeah, what does that mean? And obviously, it means something different for everyone. But I'd love to hear you speak to that in your own way, because when I hear what you just described, is I hear this redirection or reorientation toward tending to the more wild parts of you, to the
Hmm.
more earthen parts of you, and reclaiming stories that are more wild in nature.
Hmm.
But I have this contrast with Jan Blake where
Right,
very clearly not the case, right? So
right.
I'm just so curious to hear your perspective on that.
Totally. I got introduced to the term, kind of the modern day term of rewilding, maybe 15 years ago. Um, and but before that, there's this clear narrative, particularly for the black body, that the white folks went into the jungle and rescued these wild black folks and then put them on ships and civilized them. And we see this kind of with the native culture in America, this kind of um, justifying horrific acts on black bodies because they were quote unquote wild. So I can understand that historical narrative.
Mhm.
Um, and there's a piece that I've worked on a lot around black folks building right relationship with the land. So if you deal with a black person in America, we have this term tree material, and that's a lot of the horrors that we felt in our bodies from being lynched. And oftentimes we were done hung from trees in the wild, in nature environments in the South. This is a common place. We were hung, unfortunately, a lot of places, but trees were a favorite place to put us. So there's an internalized trauma story, which is black bodies in nature. So I saw rewilding.
Mm,
I started to attend these events oftentimes as a person supporting diversity with white folks that love nature, rightfully so, that were rewilders, that were reclaiming ancestral skills. They were living in these beautiful handcrafted shelters. They were doing all kinds of leather work, and it's amazing in a sense. But I saw the first time I went to these environments, how much my body was like, I am not safe. Not just
mm,
because of these white folks that were present. That wasn't the only force. It was an ancestral terror that I had not grieved yet, to
uh,
allow myself to be in right relationship with the earth. And there
mm,
is a piece that came up for me, and I'll get back to the rewilding piece directly, but in my rewilding process myself personally, there was a grief I was doing with this beautiful redwood I was just hanging out with and grieving with, and it was in a pretty quiet nighttime space. And this simple phrase popped up in my mind, says, the trees were unwilling participants in the lynching of black bodies.
oof,
And it just separated these majestic beings that they were being violated as well.
yeah.
They were unwilling participants in this activity. And somehow that just turned a corner for me and
Mm,
allowed me to start building a relationship with the earth, and particularly with trees. At that time, I already had done really well living in Earth Dome and being with the clay and being with the trees in a dark forest activated something I needed to get part of. So I think for me, I think of rewilding, there's something profoundly beautiful about reclaiming our relationship, our long term, long history human relationship with the earth, that I find to be a sacred place for me. But also, I find it to be um, tedious at times,
mm,
because there's a way that a lot of the people that I know that really have organized, I'll say, and have put together ecosystems around like books and podcasts and gatherings that have hundreds of people that gather every year and that sell out tickets within a couple of moments. These orgs have done little examination. They're doing better now. I've worked with some of them, but have done little examination of how different that journey might be for, say, a black body person, or a person that's been historically, ancestrally tortured by white folks in America, in these environments, are forced to work as folks enslaved. That's also a part of a healing that needs to take place. And there's like, no, let's come out to the forest, have a good time. Let's come on. It's amazing. And it is. But it
mm,
also, I have to jump through a couple more grief patterns and spaces before I arrive and go, I can remove my clothing and drop into this earth and drop into this lake and not be concerned that this white person in Oregon has never seen a black body in like 10 years, never seen a nude black body, and all they have is the propaganda, is not gonna be terrified of my
Mm,
blackness or confused about my goodness, and vice versa. That
mm,
that healing that has to happen sometimes is a part of the rewilding. There's a constant kind of teasing apart of those nuances. And so I think it's never simple, but it's always worth doing when you start to do that piece. And then I say too, is rewilding is dangerous partly because actively as we speak, and unfortunately more so as we speak right now, that black bodies are unconsciously fetishized by such a big swash of the white population in America that for us to be rewilding will oftentimes require us not to worry about clothes too much, not
mm,
to worry about hiding and covering our sensuality that much. What requires not to tone down our voice too much, might require us to sing with abandonment and freedom. And that can really shock a
mm,
underexposed white population in, say, a rural part of a country that has not, they've been very segregated, and a little bit of blackness they ever gotten was maybe some erotic images in their porn consumption, a little bit of Hollywood, and a little bit of terrified tales from their ancestors and parents that didn't have much exposure that was positive. When this black body turns on, or this dark brown body turns on, or when this um, uh, non-white body turns on to the rewildness, oftentimes they're over sexualized, they're weaponized, they're looked at as a threat, and
mm,
those are things that have to be kind of dealt with for a black body in the United States to be in every wild state, because oftentimes there be no Western restrictions on our sensual body, no Western restrictions on our voice, and that's a very dynamic visual and a dynamic experience in a culture that I feel like um, is not used to witnessing that. And so I think
mm,
this is not just activating the white folks, it's also activating the black folks. It could activate a lot of us if we're not tracking. So rewilding is an essential part of liberation.
mm,
Rewilding is, to me, something that I don't think is talked about, practiced, and supported near enough.
mm,
But when practiced, when introduced, when experienced, it is one of the most transformative things that I have witnessed, have experienced, and can't wait for more folks to have the funding, support, and community to experience it. And I feel like I have 10 more layers of rewilding of myself that I'm looking forward to. And it's also very anti-capitalist in so many ways. And so there's a way that when you anytime you start to jack with America's money, there's a tax to pay. There's a hiding you must do to make sure that they can get their percentage of your magic if you can. So the rewilding, I love rewilding. They're like, this is how you don't pay taxes. Like, this is how you can get land, live on land, and not pay. They're really about cloaking. Now, I would say it's the consequences oftentimes is not as harsh for white folks to cloak in that way, to live on land without permits, to live on the
mm,
on the edge of the law enforcement space. And I find that when I do the same thing, I have new layers of carefulness if I decide to live in an unpermitted state, if I decide to live with the earth. And I've had code enforcement called on me. And so for me, I think there's a way that when I navigate law enforcement or code enforcement or fill in the blank, sometimes the cost is higher. It
mm.
does not mean we shouldn't risk it. It just means that we have to kind of adjust for that extra risk of folks that are oftentimes tracked more,
Right.
observed more, hold on first,
Mm,
reported more often. It's harder
mm,
for us to be in that wild state because oftentimes it means unplugging from capitalism, and capitalism has punishments for that. And so that's something that we have to just navigate. And the more privilege you have, actually, the more you can unplug. So there's a little bit
yeah.
of unawareness around that, but it's such an essential part of
Yeah.
liberation.
Yeah. Well, thank you for drawing in more awareness around that. I had shivers multiple times and I actually felt tears well up at some point in that share. So I feel it deeply. It feels so important. I'm interviewing a woman tomorrow. She's a co-founder of Primal Gathering
Mm,
in Europe. They seem to go about different parts of Europe, and it's certainly like, I don't know if they call it rewilding, but it's that. It's like, focusing on villaging technology and permaculture and land restoration and these things. And each place they go to, they're working on projects while gathering people to celebrate and learn these things together. And you're just making me think of like how important it is. It's something I hadn't thought about in that way, to create more accessibility to those spaces for non-white bodies to feel like they can actually arrive there in safety and begin to unfurl into that space, which they have every right to. I hadn't thought about it in the way you described it. And so I wonder, do you have anything that comes up right now to maybe create more accessibility to specifically to gatherings like that? Um, yeah, I mean, I'd love to share with her tomorrow,
Totally.
private. So if you have anything, and I know that there's other people in my community who also run these kinds of festivals. I'm a part of one this summer that's going to be called Reclaiming Evolution, and I bet that she hasn't thought about this.
Right. Right.
It's actually so important as we
Right.
continue to deepen these gatherings with heartfelt resonance around what we need, and to make sure we're being as um, being as sensitive and tender as we can to really be inclusive in a rooted, real way. So I'd love to hear what comes up for you.
Totally. I've been working with multiple organizations. I make agreements to work with them for like 5 years. And I work with this gathering, particularly, it's going to start actually this month. This is our 4th year working together. They have a gathering of about 500 plus people, a week-long gathering. It's really great, great gathering. And what I found to be really important, because one of the first things they decided to do is they're like, we're just going to talk about race. We're going to talk about integration. We're going to get everybody together. And it was everyone. I wasn't there, but everyone got traumatized. There was all these fractions, and it was like, this
Mm,
didn't work out. Say, they eventually try something different. But I found to be really important. Two things really important, especially about nature environments that may have been going on for a while, and they might skew, say 80%, say white, or not really as diverse as they would like. It might not even notice. They might not even, no one may ask the question. They're like, I didn't even, now that this question is being asked, I realize, wow, we don't have a lot of diversity. I didn't think about why that'd be a problem. There's a couple of things that's important to track. And one is really respecting I mean, I'm speaking from an American context, but unfortunately, Europe has a very similar history of exploiting and slavery and in Black bodies specifically. It's unfortunately not dramatically different. I think in some ways they're ahead of us. Some ways they're able to bypass it. But one thing I'll say is that it's really about seeding an integrative community. The instinct is when you realize maybe you have a gathering of 100 people, or so we'll say 100 people for a generic option, is you're like, oh my God, we need more people of diversity. We're gonna get scholarships. We'll get them in here. And that most of the time doesn't work. You might get a couple of people there, but you find yourself almost in extra conflict.
mm,
People are feeling uncomfortable. People are feeling harmed. There's microaggressions. There's all these little hurts that are
mm,
happening. That you're like, I don't understand how integration is so hard.
mm,
What I find is that if I was a organizer of an event, and I said I realized I want to make an effective integration active in this rewild nature space,
mm,
I would first get just thoughtfully and eventually deeply exposed to the lynching history of Black bodies and how much is attached to rape and sexuality. And I say even in America, but it ripples unfortunately around the world, especially how we colonized so many different ways of what happened to them in nature. Not
mm.
panic and be like, oh my God, they're never come out here, but just be honest. This is what happened.
Yeah.
These are the images you aren't supposed to see. And actually, they are Googleable now. There's so much done that's been bringing to the light. But get just in your body aware of it. It does not mean that every Black person that comes into your space is going to be terrified around nature. It just means that it's a part of the story. And then I would build relationship or hire support, but both maybe, but build intimate relationship with someone that you want to build a village with personally in your
Mm,
staff, or you could hire so like myself that will build an alliance with the organization, and you bring in a cohort of like 5 people. But beforehand, you say, I'm gonna softly comp you tickets to whatever the barriers are to get here. I want to maybe fundraise a little extra stipend to just honor the labor of participating. But what you do is I want you to come into this space and set a tone
mm,
for these white folks that may have never been exposed to Blackness. They've never danced with nudity. They never fell in love. They've been underexposed, whatever you fill in the blank, underexposed. I want you to set a tone, a
Mm-hmm.
culture of integration.
Mm.
And it'll be labor on these people, the global majority. It'll be labor on these black folks. But they're like myself, I navigate white spaces very easily. So these folks that it's not extra work. They understand what you're up to. And they
Right.
set a culture. This is step one.
Yeah.
And that culture is being set. The step two is those folks invite folks they trust organically, and that person might have some they might not get a stipend to pay, but they'll get maybe their tickets comp. So now you start with 5 and got a group of 100. Now you have 10 the following year. So a whole year has passed and you've processed that first experience of 5, and the next year there's 10. The idea is that progression is about like that, where there's a culture where that group could almost self-heal. They have a relationship and trust with the other. So if something happens from the outside from this experience, they can self-heal. They have a village assault and they have a commitment with the core leadership or with this organization to actually support them. They're coming in with support on their mind. And that's such a tone. So eventually, when you get that critical mass of 10 or 20 to a ratio of 100, you're getting other people go, wow, that's a diverse, or I'm going to go there. And they might go there and go, this is kind of racist. I thought they're farther along. And they'll go to those black folks that are built to culture and they're going to be like, oh, they get updated by folks that are in love with the experience, but also can give an honest critique of it. They're not compromised to the point. These are balanced minds here that are not going to be like gaslighting the black folks that are having problems. Say, we are in a journey and we will support you. And you'll look up, and no one hears it, but you look up in 10 years and you will have a sustainable, thoughtful, integrated space that's built on relationship, that's built on healing in increments of time, that is sustainable. I think some version of seeding integration as opposed to like opening the gates is, I
Yeah.
think, a mistake. And I think in that context, why I always work with orgs for like 5 years,
Yeah.
because I know it's like 5, then 10, then 20. These groups are packed out at 500 people. So they're not having a problem selling tickets. Their problem is they have an idea of really making a space that is thoughtful. And that's a culture. You have to have a culture setting space. Because you can have one person in the global majority come in with a trauma-led experience, and now you have a trauma-led culture being built there. Because they're inviting their cousins that are also in the same space and are in addiction or whatever it might be, and they just show up as a militant critique of the white space, and there's a place for that. But that is the only revenue. There's no place of love and tenderness and analysis and critique that goes back and forth. That I can make a mistake as a black body in this white space, and I can receive the critique and also can give it. If it's not this kind of flow of information skillfully, it's hard to build a safe container for anyone. And so that's the place that I would say would be important. And I think slow is the fastest way to
Yeah.
integrate a space. If you're an established org and you already have momentum, I think slow is the fastest way. If you're just starting out, you're like, I got this idea, I got $500,000 and I got a good idea and a couple of Motley Crew folks, different story. But if you're already established, I find that to be probably the most effective way to have sustainable diversity.
Yeah.
Particularly with black bodies, which oftentimes the hardest ones to find in these rural rewilding environments, which I think are really built for us in so many ways when it comes to our extended lineage of nature connection.
Beautifully laid out, man. The slow work of culture making is so essential. Again, to bring Bio in, he's so amazing. He says, these times are urgent, let us slow down. And I think that that's one of our major faults, is that the momentum of the techno-industrial capitalist geopolitical machine is so fast-paced that it's shaped our minds and our hearts and our bodies to feel like everything needs to be done quickly. But you can't force culture. I'm reminded of, like, if you want a healthy, diverse, natural forest to regenerate, you have to tend to the successionary stages of it. You can't just go plant all the same age saplings of the trees that you want and force a forest. You can, it'll grow, but it's not going to be resilient. And it's the same way with changing these subcultures, and eventually the overculture is, it has to be slow, it has to be tender, it has to be sensitive. So the way you laid that out was so beautiful, man. And it makes me think, we're coming near the end of the conversation, and it makes me think of how important it is to tend to the children. And I know that you work with youth, is that right? Yeah, with an organization, it's called Turn It Up Now, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering what you're noticing in this these groups of the younger generation that you're working with that that inspires you, gives you hope, or not even just that, but just like whatever is coming up for you now that feels important to reflect on, that you're noticing, thematic threads in your work with the youth in this way.
I think for me, I always say children are our teachers, um, in so many ways. It's always been a theme for me. But what I'm seeing with young folks is there's this brilliant, brilliant minds that are exposed to the internet, and they're underexposed to nature. They're underexposed to interacting with each other, to young conflict. Growing up in the '90s, I could see the contrast there. I'm like, oh, '90s was better. I would have loved to be a young person now on some levels, but there's a level of nervous systems that are deeply nourished by slowing down to be with nature, but are overstimulated by the amount of digital exposure that they have. And so there's a constant patience that I have and have built with how do we get young folks get their hands on the earth and get their hands less in addictive posture towards digital and social media. And they see it too. A lot of the teens I see now are like, we're actually taking these apps off our phone. We're trying to low key unaddict ourselves. But I think there could be a lot more empathy and patience with the damage that us as adults have done by creating these ecosystems of digital worlds without a real investment in our young folks being connected with each other and with the earth. And I think there's something I notice when I go into like a first grade class. I tell the story a lot, but it feels important. And it feels a indicator of many ways in which our young folks are robbed of really essential nutrients of being. And that is, I go into a first grade class and I say, who in here is a singer? And they all raise their hand in first grade and kindergarten. They're all like almost falling out of the chair. I'm a singer. And
Yeah.
sure enough, we all sing for 45 minutes. We beatbox. I said, who here is a beatboxer? I'm a beatboxer. What's a beatboxer? I said, you make beats with your mouth. I'm a beatboxer. And we beatbox and we sing for 45 minutes flawlessly. They have a good time. They're giggling, they're laughing. Teachers almost get annoyed because they're still singing and still beatbox after I leave. And they're trying to teach science. And they're in it. The kids have it. They love it. They're naturally there. And I walk out of that class to go to the third grade, and I go in third grade. Who in here is a singer? And half the class will raise their hand, because already I saw from kindergarten and first grade, by the time you get to third grade, they're
Mm,
like, I'm more self-aware. I've been told that I'm not good. I think they've internalized. And I walk
yeah.
out. By the time I get to fifth grade and I say, who in here is a singer? I might be lucky to get one person to raise their hand and go, I'm a singer in fifth grade. And in one day, I could see from kindergarten to fifth grade that their
Yeah.
voice has been taken.
Yeah.
And that to me is where we as parents, as guardians, as teachers, keep them singing, keep them curious, keep their voice, because singing music is a part of a human right. It's an
Yeah.
indicator of how you connect with nature. It's an indicator of how you connect with each other. Singing is a village activity. It's not American Idol. It's not how good you are. It's about breathing, farting, eating, singing. They're all together.
Yeah.
Grieving. They're all together. And so for me, that's what I see with young folks, is that our schools methodically, there's definitely pushback on this, but our schools methodically taking our young people's voices. And I'm like, let's fight for that back. Let's fight
Hmm.
for that back. Reclaim our dances, reclaim our singing, make it a part of Village again. And
Yeah.
that's what I'm working a lot with young folks. It's like, let's sing.
Yeah.
Let's sing. It's accessible. Let's sing.
Yeah. Well, that one hits deep within me, man, because I can almost like remember the moment where I stopped singing when I was young. And I was probably, yeah, maybe in that grade 2, grade 3 zone, something like that. And it was actually, um, I think it was a whole series of things, but I remember my mother saying something to me that
Yeah.
actually was like a
Yeah.
huge catalyst for that. And
Yeah.
so I let go of it. I remember being like a teenager and young adult and saying things like, "Oh, I can't sing."
Yeah.
And over time, through the grace of certain folks in my journey, I've been able to reclaim it. But interestingly, recently I'm singing a lot just randomly because I feel like life just like asks us to sing. It's just, if you're feeling like alive and influenced by the aliveness of the moment, it's like song just kind of naturally rises. And so the thing I'm working with now is my current partner, she said it a couple times now, and she said it the other day, something like, when are you going to actually sing?
Mm,
Because
mm,
it's still this part of me
yeah,
where, sure, I'm singing, but there's a part of me that's holding back
yeah,
from like being like really into the
yeah.
authenticity of it. So it's
Yes,
layered is what I'm trying to say.
yes, 100%. You've nailed it when it comes to that journey, and I applaud you for reclaiming and encourage you to continue to find what it looks like to open that up even further.
Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, we're at the end here, and the way I'd love to close is for you to, I guess, if there's any kind of like message that feels like it's very present and alive and important to share, but even more specifically, if there are some questions,
Mm,
there's questions that you want to share with the listeners, of like just prompts of like, hey, carry these questions with you into your
mm,
days, and see how they shape your perception and your experience.
mm. One of the things that has been shaping me is asking the question of who or what is shaping my listening ear. I didn't realize how much my American culture, my TikTok, social media, Facebook
Mm.
has given me less attention in my listening ability.
Yeah.
And one thing I have realized, particularly here in the United States, is we're really good at mass communication, but very poor at listening. And the way to like address that is like, who has shaped it? Who has shaped my ability to listen?
Mm,
Who or what entity has shaped where I put my attention, how I receive, who I can listen to, what level of education one must have to be heard by me,
mm,
um,
mm,
fill in the blank. But who has shaped my listening ear?
mm.
I invite that. It has transformed my entire life.
Yeah. Yeah. That's got to be one of the most important questions of these times, probably always, but especially in this time of just tremendous overflow of information and opinion and perspective, from all kinds of entities. It's like, yeah, what is your natural hearing? How does your body resonate with the truth of what you feel, what you experience, what you hear? How does that actually inform your actions too, right? I remind people of this quote often. I think it was Sackedge Henderson. He said, to risk, oh no, to truly listen is to risk being changed forever.
Mm,
And I think we all inherently know that, you know, at the unconscious level at least. And if we can bring that understanding to consciousness, I think that that's going to help us along the path more than we can know. And I think that unconscious holding, when we keep it in the unconscious, that it stimulates fear, because of
mm,
course changing changing in a life affirming way is difficult, because sometimes it can be like violent in some ways, right? The way that we have to shape shift to actually become who we're here to become, or to belong in the way that we're here to belong, that there's often a lot of painful unlearning. And I think, the Zen Buddhists say uncarving of your block. And
mm,
it's not that like, to be carved hurts, right? And so to mend that uncarving, so to say, it also hurts. But the thing that I think is beautiful about that is that you're coming into greater wholeness again. And so whatever hurt there is, it's inevitably going to be wrapped up in feelings of, yeah, belonging and solidarity and wholeness and love, ultimately, I think. So yeah, powerful question. Thank you for that.
oh, you're welcome. Thanks for giving us space for it.
hmm Is there anything you want to point people toward, in terms of offerings or ways to engage with the various organizations or work that you're up to? Anything coming up soon to point people toward?
Yeah, I have a short documentary that's
That's
streaming online, Dark and Tender. It's findable on cutproject.org. It would be huge to get as many eyeballs, hands, people sharing that. It's going to stream probably for the remainder of this year, and so would love to get as many people sharing that, watching it, engaging with it. We have a feature film coming out following year, but it's going to be hugely supported by this short film. So it's 18 minutes, 50 seconds, but it's profound imagery of Black men being tender with each other in a way that I feel like is not near visible enough. So the more you all raise the flag, the more we can return the tide on this narrative of the Black brute that has not gone really interrupted in America. So definitely here to interrupt it.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So that's streaming now. It's
Hmm.
available currently. Okay.
Yeah,
So yeah, we'll absolutely put a link in it in the show notes, and I look forward to tuning into that myself.
yeah.
Thank you for doing that work, man. It's so I can just feel the sincerity and the
Mm.
presence and the aliveness and the love that you have for your life and your body and the orientation to facilitate that in others. It's so important, and I it's really honorable, and I just praise you and the work that you're doing in the world.
Thank you so much. So glad to meet you. And as you're traveling, maybe we'll bump into each other in the near future. So looking
That,
forward to the leave.
that would be wonderful. Are you mostly in the Mojave Desert, did you say?
I live in the Mojave Desert, but I travel, or now I'm traveling a lot promoting
You're
this film and workshops. So I'm right now on my way up to Seattle, Portland, Northwest, but I kind of run the West and then dip over to Colorado, and then run the West and dip over to Asheville. But I kind of have a little trek from the Mojave Desert to the peninsula of Washington.
okay. I will be up in that direction in June and July. So
Okay. Okay.
yeah. So yeah, we'll talk about it if that's possible to
Yeah.
collide in some meaningful
Yeah.
moments.